graph of this 1/2 x minus 5 all squared plus 9. We again want to locate the vertex of this. Okay, so here's my vertex. This vertex is at 5 and 9. And this window that I've shown here, this window is basically the x min, x max just tells the left edge, right edge of the window, the bottom edge, and the top edge of this window. And the reason why we use it is just to give us an indication of the scale of this graph. Without the scale of the windows, we have no idea whether this y-axis could be in millions, it could be in decimal 0.1 values, we don't know. So this window gives us just an indication of the scale. Now the window doesn't have to be exact, it just has to give us a general idea of the scale. So it's not like super important, and it doesn't need to be exact by any means, but it has to give us about an approximation of what the min and max edges of those windows are to give us an idea of scale. So there's my vertex. Okay, I'm going to then find my axis of symmetry through the vertex. The y-intercept of this graph is that point there. And notice that the y-intercept here is not at 9. In fact, the y-intercept works out to be, I think that is, let's see here. Is at 21.5. Okay, so that's my y-intercept is 21.5. It's going to be at that point right there. Okay, and as for the zeros, this parabola does not cross zero, so that's very important. That's curious, and in fact, because of the shape of the parabola, it isn't always necessarily going to cross the zero. So in this case here, because it's pointing up and the vertex is above the zero, it's never going to cross the zero. So this has no zeros. One thing I want you to notice that this graph, this equation is in a different form as the previous one. This is called the general form. This is a graphing form. And the general form seem to give us that numbers seem to relate to the vertex. Notice that this number does not, this number relates to the y-intercept. This number here, plus 9, does not relate to the y-intercept. And the reason is it's a different form of the equation. And the different forms of the equation tell us something different about the equations. This is the general form. It tells us something about the y-intercept. This is not the general form. So this number does not tell us anything about the y-intercept. Okay, but this is called the graphing form. The graphing form does tell us something about this graph. Okay, you may want to notice that those numbers show up on the graph. This 5 and this 9 show up at the vertex. So these numbers, especially this one here, we do not want to interpret this one as a y-intercept when it's in this form of the equation. But it seems to indicate something about the vertex. Now, something wrong with that sign there, but we're not too sure what to do with it. So let's take a look at another one here. And if you take a look at this one is also in the graphing form. Okay, this is in the graphing form. Okay, this number here is not anything to do with the y-intercept because it's not the general form. Notice that's not 15. That's a negative number there. The other thing is it's upside down. Okay, so why is this upside down and why is this graph right side up? Okay, it has something to do with that negative out front here. Okay, this one's positive, this one's negative. The positive ones seem to point up. Okay, the negative ones, there's a negative here, they seem to point down. That's a positive pointing up, negative pointing down. So let's find those important parts of this graph. Again, the vertex is going to be important. So there's my vertex. It's going to be at -6, +15. And we noticed in the previous one that these two numbers these numbers here seem to have something to do with the vertex. In fact, that's the same here. This number and this number seem to have something to do with the vertex. Now the sign seems to be a little bit off, but that was the same problem we had here, and maybe we can just account for that and say that's the opposite. Okay, that the x-coordinate is going to be the opposite of that sign. So if it's negative, we're at positive. If it's positive, we're at negative. And that is a relationship that we do want to look at and identify. The vertex is the most important because it gives us our line of symmetry at x equals negative 6. Okay, we have a y-intercept. Our y-intercept, when we plug this in, x is 0. You can just touch that on your Desmos graph. Okay, it's going to be at negative 3. So it looks like that coordinate there is at negative 3. That's our y-intercept. And again, notice that this number in this form has nothing to do with the y-intercept. We actually have to plug in x equals 0 and calculate that. Our zeros for this graph, that point here and that point there, those are the zeros of that graph. I'm going to calculate the zeros. We have a 0 at negative 0.5. I'm going to round this to 5.2. Okay, and when I find the 0 of that other function, of the other point here, on Desmos it's much easier, you can just type in. I'm going to get negative 11.448. And so my windows, I have to adjust my windows here. My window is about negative, maybe negative 15, something like that. Okay, and again, the windows give us an indication of the scale of this graph. Okay, so there it is. We're finding all those important points. Again, if we find the middle of those 2 points, that's going to be our axis symmetry. So we add those two numbers together. We're going to get negative 12, and divide by 2 gives us the middle point of negative 6. Those points of symmetry are really, really important. Okay, this is the most important, most striking feature of our parabola is its symmetry. And we need to make sure we're using the math of the symmetry to help us deal with these problems. The graphing form seems to have some indication of vertex. The positive and negative coefficients seem to do with something to do with whether the parabola is oriented up or down. The general form equation, and again, make sure you do not mix these forms up. This seems to give us some indication of the y-intercept, because when x is 0, that's the number we're left with. So these are the key things that we want to be looking at when we're dealing with these parabolas. These are the 4 key features of the parabola we always want to be able to identify, and what we're going to start doing is relating them to the different forms of the equation.